Welcome to AI for Good, the leading, action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by the International Telecommunication Union, the United Nations Agency for Digital Technologies, in partnership with 50+ UN, sister organizations and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to unlock AI's potential to serve humanity. In today's AI for Good event, we are counting on you to use the live video wall feature, to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished facilitators and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Shizhi Jiang from Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to AI for Good webinar series. And I'm honored to introduce our speaker today, Professor Sebastian Sippel. Sebastian is a tenure-track professor for climate attribution at the University of Leipzig since 2023. He studied environmental science at the University of Bayreuth and Oxford, completing his PhD in 2017 on weather and climate extremes and their impact on ecosystem functioning at the Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry and ETH Zurich. He then worked as a postdoc and senior scientist in climate physics at ETH Zurich, focusing on attribution methods and improving our understanding on climate variability and extreme events in models and observations. And his research at Leipzig now focuses more on improving methods to link climate variabilities and weather and climate extreme events to causal factors. And before we begin, just a quick reminder to our online audience, if you have questions during the talk, please post them in the neural network and we'll come back to them in the Q&A. And now, Sebastian, the floor is yours, and we are looking forward to your talk.
All right, thank you very much, Shisha, for the introduction. I hope you can hear me now. Speaking. Yeah, so thank you for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to speak here this afternoon. Thanks for joining. And the title of my talk is Understanding Past Climate Events and Trends to Constrain Near Future Climate Risk. And in my presentation, I would like to kind of shed light on a mystery that I've been working on over the past couple of years, which is a paper and a few and follow-up papers about early 20th century cold biases in ocean surface temperature observations. That will be the main focus of my talk, and there will be basically three subsections in which I will present new global mean temperature reconstructions that are based separately on ocean and land data. I will then show that there has been a large multi-decadal cold anomaly in the ocean in the early 20th century. And I will then present follow-up research from a colleague from a new paper that is a bit of an independent evaluation of cold biases based on new analysis techniques. And in the final part of my presentation, I would like to talk about implications of this stream of research for near future climate risk. And because I thought that we will have a broad audience today, I thought I would briefly introduce global mean surface temperature. So global mean surface temperature, of course, is a key policy metric, as we know, for example, from the Paris goals and so on. And so it is important to really understand the past behavior of global mean surface temperature. Now, if we kind of look into different reconstructions from different institutes, such as the Hadley Center in the UK or colleagues in the US, we see that these different reconstructions that are available back to, say, 1850 or so, they are in reasonable agreement. However, it's important to note that these observation-based estimates of global mean surface temperature are based on blending sea surface temperatures over oceans with land surface air temperatures. So global mean surface temperature really is a combination of sea surface temperatures over ocean and land surface air temperatures. And now if we go one step deeper, of course, in 1870 or in the late 19th century or also in the early 20th century, the the measurements of temperatures around the globe were really far from complete. So the coverage was spatially really limited, in particular in the early instrumental record. So as an example, you see the coverage in the months of January 1909 in one of those standard global mean surface temperature data sets. And you see that there was kind of reasonable coverage over many kind of ocean basins and continents, but also a lot of gaps. And so this coverage is limited, and the observing techniques have been varying over time. We will hear more about this a bit in my talk, that those techniques, especially of the sea surface temperature measurements, they have really changed over time. And it's also important to note that these LSAT, so the land surface air temperatures, and the sea surface temperature measurements, because they come from different measurement devices, they also contain very different biases and uncertainties. And we will see a little bit of that in my talk. Now, if we dive a little bit deeper, we see that if we just look at the sea surface temperatures and land surface air temperatures kind of separately from each other, and we plot here basically the global mean reconstruction for the ocean sea surface temperatures and the land temperatures. In gray, this is a standard land surface temperature data set. In blue is the ocean data set. We see that they are, at first sight, in reasonable agreement. Both of them have been warming over the last 70-ish years or so. However, if we compare the warming slopes of the last period, so for example, the last 50 years, we see that the land is warming much faster than the ocean, with a ratio of about 1.8. And this warming is very much expected. That's kind of understood from well-known physics, that the land has to warm faster than the ocean. So this is very much so the warming over the last 50, 60, 70 years. And the differential warming between land and ocean is really well understood by a physical understanding. However, if we kind of focus on this early period of warming, so there has been an early period of warming before, roughly starting from the beginning of the 20th century, leading up to roughly the Second World War. This early 20th century warming period, the land-ocean warming ratio is really quite different. And if we compare those two data sets here, we find that the land-ocean warming ratio is really below 1, which means that the ocean in that period would have warmed more than the land. And just from basic physical understanding, we may think that this is hard to imagine, because there are these physical constraints that should tell us if there is a global warming happening, that then the land should warm more than the ocean. So I'm going to ask the main research question in this research: how consistent are global mean surface temperature estimates if we derive them individually from land air temperatures and individually from sea surface temperatures? And I'm going to introduce now a reconstruction method. And the reconstruction method is based on climate models. The climate models are, just again mentioning this for the broad audience we have today, are numerical climate models that are based on quantitative methods to simulate the interactions of important drivers of the climate system, including atmosphere, oceans, land surface, and ice. And the key thing with the climate model simulations is that we have a complete field. So with the climate models, we have a complete field of temperatures over oceans and over land. And so we can use those climate models as a basis for training statistical learning and machine learning models to reconstruct temperature fields if they have a limited coverage, such as temperature fields in reality. And now I would like to introduce my reconstruction method that I used for this paper I'm presenting here. So I am, again, as I said, I'm using kind of CMIP6, so the standard set of climate model simulations. I'm using temperature anomaly patterns, and we are masking them to observed coverage for each time step. So for example, if you think back to the picture that I showed you at the beginning, for January 1901, or here it's illustrated for the land temperature measurements for June 1895. So you see all colored grid cells are those grid cells that contain measurements in June 1895. So we are basically masking each CMIP6 model simulations to the observed coverage for each individual time step. We are then putting all these simulations for all the different years into a very big matrix here, where each row is a where each column is a predictor. So each column is a grid cell, is a predictor in space, and each row is basically one sample climate model simulations for any particular year. And then we are basically putting all of these in a big matrix, and the goal is that we train statistical and machine learning methods in order to basically reconstruct the true global mean. So what we are doing is we are trying to train a regression model, and I've illustrated this here as a linear regression, but it can be much more complicated. I will get to that, where we have a field with limited coverage, and we're trying to estimate the true spatial global mean surface temperature. And we're doing this individually for land surface air temperatures and for sea surface temperatures. And in addition, because of course the climate models are not simulating the measurement uncertainties and biases that we have in the observations, but we do have some understanding of the measurement uncertainties and biases in the observations. So in addition to masking the climate model fields to the observed coverage, we are also adding estimates of the observation-based uncertainties and biases for these particular times that we are trying to reconstruct. But of course, we are not showing the algorithm anything of the true observations. We are just showing the algorithm the covariance matrices that basically try to estimate the uncertainties. And basically, in this very simple illustrated linear regression case, we are then trying to estimate basically a large vector of coefficients here, of regression coefficients that are basically allowing us to do an optimal GMST reconstruction. So we see, for example, here for that particular case, if we use a statistical learning methods that's based on a rich regularization, we see that those grid cells that are kind of close to the tropics, they get large weights. So the darker colors indicate bigger weights in the reconstruction. So it tells us that for this particular time step in June 1895, in order to reconstruct global mean surface temperatures, the grid cells that are kind of close to the tropics, they receive much more weights than the grid cells, say, in the high latitudes. And also we see that coastal grid cells, for example, here along the coast of Northern America, or also of East Asia or South Asia, we see that also those coastal grid cells receive more weight. And all of these is expected by understanding of climate variability, because we have in the land data the large ocean basins missing, and that's why the algorithm basically sees that there's a lot to be learned from the coastal grid cells. So we do that for land data and for ocean data, and in both cases we try to estimate the global mean surface temperature. And if we do an evaluation of this, we see that we receive like about 20% lower mean squared error compared to a simple benchmarking method that has been previously used for reconstructions before 1950. So the algorithm is particularly useful or efficient in the period where there are large gaps in the data. So in the time before 1950, where just the coverage is very limited. And in a second step, we do not want to just train an algorithm based on the climate models. Of course, we want to apply it to observations to basically come up with an observation-based reconstruction. So in a second step, once we have trained all these different regression models, we are basically taking the observations, put them into like a matrix here, and we basically take our reconstruction model to basically reconstruct the global mean surface temperature from the observations. And again, we do this for land data and for ocean data separately. That means we use the CRUTEM-5 here as a standard land surface air temperature data set. So we put in the standard CRUTEM-5 data set in our models, and we arrive at a GMST estimate based on the land data only. And then we take, similarly, the head SST4 dataset, that's the standard SST dataset from our colleagues in the UK. And we put them into our basically ocean-based models, and we arrive at a global mean surface temperature estimate for that is only based on ocean data. So we have these two different estimates based on land and ocean, and we're going to compare these two time series very soon. I wanted to briefly say that we have also compared this reconstruction method. So I've shown you a simple example based on standard ridge regression, which uses a regularization in order to basically regularize, because we have a large set of spatial predictors. However, we also compared our reconstruction method to a more complex image in painting deep neural network, that was published by our colleague Christoph Cardo a few years ago, where similarly a deep neural network is basically trained to reconstruct a whole global field based on a field with missing values, and then we compute from this full reconstruction of the global field. We compute the global mean surface temperature. We've compared it to our more simple method. The results are almost identical and very similar, and so I'm going to show you here the results that were shown in the paper. So those from the more simple statistical learning method. Okay, now let's have a look at the results, and I'll take a short sip. So first, I would like to show you the two reconstructions themselves. So we see now in gray the standard HADCRUD5 dataset. So that's basically the standard GMST dataset that's based on blending. So that contains both land and ocean data. So that's very much the standard temperature dataset that's used in IPCC assessments. And I'm also showing you in orange now our reconstruction that is based on the CRUTIM5 record, so based on the land temperature only. So that's orange. And the HADSST4 based reconstruction, so the reconstruction that's based on the ocean data only. And maybe we can focus on the nice things first and then the more complicated things. So if we look at our reconstructions after 1945 or so, up until today, we see that the ocean-based reconstruction and the land-based reconstruction, as well as the standard product, which is both of them combined, give almost identical results. So if you want to understand how the climate has changed over the last 70 or 80 years, you get really virtually identical results if you look at reconstructions from land data only and reconstructions of global mean surface temperatures for ocean data only. So that's nice because it shows that the reconstruction is doing useful things. Also, if we look into kind of the first 40 years, interestingly, or the first 45 years, so before 1900, we also see that the ocean and the land-based reconstructions are in reasonable agreement. Of course, the correlation is not as high as in the later period, but still we see a reasonable agreement between the two. We can also quantify this consistency. So again, there's a high consistency between land and SST-based reconstruction in this long-term GMST warming. So as an example, the IPCC AR6 report looks at warming in the kind of last decade, the last full decade from 2011 to 2020, compared to the very early time, so 1850 to 1900. The IPCC AR6 says that the global warming has been 1.09 degrees, and our land-based reconstruction of GMST gives us an estimate of 1.07 degrees. The ocean-based reconstruction gives us an estimate of 1.1 degrees. So these two are really kind of in the long term in very good agreement. And also, if we look into the interannual correlation or the interannual agreement between our land and ocean-based reconstruction. So just looking here as an example at the Pearson correlation of our reconstruction, say in the first 50 years, so annual values for 50 years. If we look into the raw data, so if we just correlate the global land average with the global ocean-based average, we see a correlation of 0.47. Now, if we correlate our two reconstructions that are, supposed to give us an estimate of the global mean surface temperature, so we see that the agreement between both data sets really increases by the reconstruction. So this gives us some confidence that our reconstructions are actually giving us useful and robust results. So I've told you, we start with the nice things first. So here comes the more complicated puzzle. So we see that if we again look at our two reconstructions, we see that there's a strong discrepancy between our ocean and our land reconstruction between roughly 1900 up to 1930, where the ocean-based reconstruction really kind of drops for 0.3 degrees or so around 1900 or just after 1900, starting a bit earlier, and then basically recovers towards 1930 or 1940 or so, but where over a period of several decades, the ocean-based reconstruction is really substantially colder than our land-based reconstruction. And this is a puzzle that we will focus on now. So we have been asking in our paper, could it be that such a strong multi-decadal ocean cold anomaly where the ocean is just much colder than the land? Could it be that this is realistic? First of all, we try to understand with an attribution approach if this is due to an external response of the climate system or if it's due to internal variability in the climate system. And so again, in the panel A here, you see a few more lines, but still let's focus on the orange and the blue ones, which are the exact same reconstructions that I've shown you in the previous plot. We do see that if we low pass and high pass filter the data, we see that if in the high pass filtered version, so if we look at so that's panel C now, if we look into kind of the short-term variability between the ocean and the land-based reconstruction, we see that they are in exceptionally good agreement. So they are highly correlated. So the short-term interannual variability between the ocean and the land is really high. So if there's things like a strong ENSO and a strong El Nino in the climate system, then this is being picked up by both the ocean and the land data. So this again gives us confidence in the reconstructions. And we see that the main reason for this discrepancy between the ocean and the land data lies, and we see this in panel B, in the low pass filtered version. So if we low pass filter our data, we see that there is a strong discrepancy between the ocean data and the land data. And it does not matter which kind of ocean data set we use or which kind of land data set we use, there's just a strong disagreement. If we take our climate models to estimate the force response, so the response to known external forcings to the climate system, and we subtract those from our reconstructions, we arrive at panel E and F, where the unforced low pass filter time series, we still see a very strong disagreement between ocean and land, whereas the unforced high pass filter time series still shows a very good agreement. So again, we see that this ocean cold anomaly is really a decadal scale anomaly in the climate system, while the high frequency component, so the interannual variability, is in very good agreement. The next question that we have been asking is, could it be that this is that such an anomaly just arises from variability in the climate system? Is it possible that there's, let's say, a decadal mode of climate variability that would just produce such a decoupling between the ocean and the land? So what we did was we compared the range of variability across all CMIP6 models. So that's shown in red here. So that's the red envelope. So this is basically the range of variability in the difference between the ocean and the land-based GMST reconstruction. And we compare this difference to the difference between our two reconstructions, so the ocean reconstruction minus the land reconstruction. You see that around 1900, this gray or black lines from our reconstructions, they really turn negative and move out of the envelope of variability of the climate models. So in other words, internal variability in the climate system cannot really explain this ocean cold anomaly, because if internal variability could explain the variability, then the variation in the gray line of our reconstructions should be within the variability of the climate model. So this decoupling that we are seeing here in the real observations, it cannot be reproduced by any CMIP6 model. I will skip this slide, I think, for time reasons. And then, of course, we have been asking, where does this come from? Is this a global anomaly? Are there kind of certain spatial patterns to this anomaly? And so we have been looking at kind of spatial patterns of this kind of anomaly. And we are looking into kind of temperature patterns here, where we compare basically the first 20 years in the 20th century, so 1900 to 1920, with basically a period in the late 19th century, 1871 to 1890, in which both the land and the ocean-based reconstruction have been still in agreement. So we are basically just looking at how have the mean temperatures changed in the early 20th century compared to a period in the late 19th century. And if we compute this difference for a standard temperature dataset, Berkeley Earth, we are actually seeing that most of the global land areas have been slightly warming in this time, whereas the ocean has been pretty strongly cooling as a difference between those two decades. And we see that this is kind of largely a global pattern. So the Americas have completely slightly warm, whereas the oceans around the Americas have almost entirely been cooling. Similarly for Africa and most parts of Eurasia. And so we do see that this land-ocean difference in the early 20th century really comes from somehow a global signal, or a signal that is at least kind of in most continental temperature measurements. And also if we do statistical tests for different regions, or if we kind of stratify into a global region, Northern Hemisphere extratropics, tropics, Southern Hemisphere extratropics, or if we focus on kind of coastal grid cells of the coastal Pacific, the coastal Atlantic, or the coastal Indian Ocean, in all those regions, if we compare only the coastal stations, we find that the land stations in orange have warmed significantly more than the ocean stations, which have generally been cooling. So this seems to be a bit odd, that the land has been warming while the ocean has been cooling over such a multi-decadal period. So we kind of go further, and we have been testing kind of standard paleoclimate reconstructions in order to have like a little bit of an independent estimate of the changes. And in these plots here, you see that basically these violin plots here show again this temperature difference, the temperature change between the early 20th century, 1901 to 20, compared to our period in the late 19th century. And this again in orange, the land-based reconstruction, in blue, the ocean-based reconstruction, which has been strongly cooling, while the land-based reconstruction has been slightly warming. And all the different gray violins here are different paleoclimate reconstructions that have been used widely in the IPCC report. And basically, these are all different reconstruction methods based on standard paleoclimate proxies. And basically, all these proxies seem to indicate that there has been very little change between the late 19th century and the early 20th century, relatively little change. And our ocean-based, so the ocean-based reconstruction is really not in agreement with these paleoclimate proxies. So the ocean shows much more cooling than those paleoclimate proxies would indicate. And similarly, and again, I will skip this for time reasons, if we look into kind of individual ocean basins and individual ocean paleoclimate proxies, we also see that the ocean-based estimates, they are kind of cooling much more in the early 20th century than we are seeing from the paleoclimate proxies here shown in violet for individual ocean regions. All right, so what does that mean then in total? So it means that largely we see, or we have been kind of inferring from these different lines of evidence that I've just presented to you, that it may be plausible that we're seeing a cold bias in early 20th century ocean surface temperature measurements. And what, of course, one could do is one could say, okay, we know from climate models, so all these kind of colored dots here are climate models. We know that the land warming and the ocean warming over periods of, say, 40 years or so are strongly constrained. They are not developing independently. There's really a strong constraint between the land warming and the ocean warming. So, of course, we could try to build a constraint from land warming onto the ocean warming using those climate models that are giving us kind of realistic estimates for this relationship. And if we do that and we compare this to the observation-based reconstructions, we see that if we look at the trend, the temperature trend before this cold period in the early 20th century, so 1871 to 1910, we see that the land has basically not changed much, but the ocean has been strongly cooling. And that's why it really lies outside of this basically this range of CMIP6 models, whereas in the period after basically in the period after the cold period, so starting in the early 20th century, 1901 to 1940, we are seeing that the ocean is basically warming much more than the land, but it basically just recovers from this very cool period. And so one could basically build a constraint from land warming on ocean warming, which would then turn out that it's likely that the ocean has been too cool in this early 20th century. So coming to the kind of conclusions from part one, from the paper that we published last year, there is a very high consistency between land-based and ocean-based estimates in really the largest part of the instrumental record, which is good news, of course. It means that our estimates of climate warming are very solid and robust. However, there is an unexplained ocean cold anomaly that was identified during roughly 1900 to 1930. And the different line of evidence that I've just shown you, based on attribution, statistics, the coastal patterns, paleoclimate data, suggests that the early 20th century ocean cold anomaly likely arises partly, or at least partly, due to uncorrected biases in sea surface temperature measurements. And now I'm continuing, basically trying to answer what those biases could be. So of course, we would like to know and understand what could have been going wrong in this early period. And for this, it's important to know, and I'm relying here a lot on the really fantastic work that my colleague Duo Chan has been doing in the last couple of years. So if we kind of try to understand what are these sea surface temperature measurements in the early 20th century, they are basically almost entirely based on bucket temperature measurements. So seafarers have been basically throwing buckets into the water, have been pulling the buckets on their ship, and then have been measuring the water temperature in the bucket. And of course, there are many things that could bias those measurements. It depends on the evaporative cooling of those buckets. It depends on how long those buckets are being on deck before the temperature is taken, and so on. And of course, it also depends on the material of the bucket. So you see here different pictures. There are very different types of buckets which have been used to measure sea surface temperatures. And of course, all of these buckets have different evaporative cooling characteristics and so on. So what my colleague Duo Chan has done in a paper that he published with co-authors just a few months ago was that they looked at the diurnal cycle in those sea surface temperature data, so the day-night differences. And he's basically saying that using the amplitude of the diurnal cycle in sea surface temperatures, we provide evidence that wooden to canvas bucket transitions were mostly complete by the early 1900s, earlier than commonly assumed by 2 decades, resulting in strong early 20th century cold biases. So what Duo Chan is saying here is that there has been, and this is well known in the literature, there has been a transition from wooden buckets which are better insulated to canvas buckets in the early 20th century. So canvas buckets are very poorly isolated. Therefore, those canvas buckets show a stronger diurnal cycle, but they are also kind of more conducive to cooling. And basically, my colleague here has been showing that those transitions have happened earlier than has been assumed previously. And if we look into kind of the figure that I've shown you on an earlier slide, so if we look at the global SST adjustment that is basically implied from my reconstruction, so the red line here is basically the reconstruction, the adjustment, so the bias correction in the SSTs that according to kind of our reconstructions should have taken place. That's the red lines here. So it shows that the ocean is really there must be like a huge adjustment to the ocean data because they have been measured too cold. And in blue, you see the line of basically the standard adjustments that are being done for the sea surface temperature measurements. And you see a little uptake here in like 1910 or so, which is exactly because of this known transition from wooden to canvas buckets. But in our data also, we see that this transition, it probably happened a little bit earlier, and it probably was a little bit stronger than has been assumed so far. So this is really, Duo Chan really communicates here very nicely, basically, that it seems that those transitions have been earlier than commonly thought. And based on this diurnal cycle analysis, what my colleague Duo Chan has been doing then in this paper is that you see on the left-hand side for the tropics, the diurnal amplitude anomalies. So this is the orange line here. So these are basically anomalies in the diurnal cycle. And he basically compares them to standard temperature, SST temperature data sets. So in blue, in green, and in light blue, these are standard SST products. And all of them only show basically a little uptick, but not such a strong uptick in the SST corrections going into the early 20th century. And Duo also has what is written here as DC SST. These are the corrections if they are inferred from land. And we see that if those corrections would be inferred from land, they seem to fit much better to these diurnal cycle anomalies. So this really provides, in my opinion, independent evidence that this diurnal cycle analysis shows that probably there was an earlier wooden to canvas bucket transition. We see this also on the right-hand side here, where there's a correlation between those SST diurnal amplitude anomalies. So again, basically the magnitude of the diurnal cycle of SST measurements. And you see that the wooden buckets are basically here on the left-hand side, and they correlate with the size of the necessary corrections. Whereas the canvas buckets, so large and small canvas buckets, they are more here on the right-hand side. So they have a larger diurnal cycle amplitude, and they have a tendency to measure too cool, and that's why there are larger corrections needed. So again, this tells us that when there were measurements done with canvas buckets, this has been leading likely to colder temperatures. This has been corrected in the past a little bit, but probably it has not been corrected enough. All right, so this was the part of my talk in which I wanted to focus and explain on those early 20th century cold biases in ocean surface temperature observations. And now I would like to briefly focus on the implication of this whole research, because you may well argue, well, why is this actually relevant for understanding present-day climate change? So I really want to spend the next 5 to 10 minutes talking about how all this understanding of the past may help us to better constrain near future climate risk. And for that, I would like to introduce this again with a paper that my colleague Duo Chan published. It's not only a paper, it's a data set. So Duo Chan has been recognizing this ocean-land discrepancy. And so he has been doing tremendous work in basically coming up with a new temperature data set that actually considers the new required bigger corrections. So what he did was he came up with a land air temperature data set. These are kind of the green point here. He homogenized the land air temperature data set. And then he used an energy balance model to infer the necessary corrections to the ocean data from coastal land air temperature measurement stations. So these are kind of the lines here to the ocean data. And then he basically he inferred those required global corrections of the ocean data from the coastal stations and an energy balance model. And then he put all these things, so the new land air temperature data set and the new corrected sea surface temperature data set, he put all of those different corrections together into a completely new and different global temperature dataset. And this global temperature dataset is called a dynamically consistent ensemble of temperature at the Earth's surface since 1850. And I think it really adds to the suite of the temperature datasets that we have. Of course, it does not replace the existing standard temperature products, but it's really a new product that takes on a new philosophy of corrections. And if we now compare, and that's from a News and Views piece written by colleagues, Osborne and Kennedy, if we now compare this new philosophy of corrections taken on in Decent to the standard products, we see a couple of differences. So Decent, this new dataset, is now shown in red here, and in blue, the different standard products that we have available. And again, we see that the last 70 or 80 years are in very good agreement. There's really not much disagreement. However, there are two periods of disagreement. This is the early 20th century, which I've shown you, where Decent is not as cold as the other standard temperature datasets. And then another shorter period of disagreement, World War II, where it's known that some of the standard products are too warm. So Decent is less cold in the early 20th century. It's less warm during World War II. And it has a slightly lower 1850 to 1900 baseline. And so we may ask, okay, what does Decent now imply for future warming? Can we use Decent to understand what may be in the pipeline in terms of future warming for us? And there has been a relatively big line of research a couple of years ago, where many different climate researchers tried to estimate whether the hot climate models, the climate models with a high climate sensitivity, could be considered plausible or not. And many of those papers, I've shown some of them here, have been concluding based on the past temperature trend. So essentially based on a correlation over the different climate models, they have been showing that the past temperature trend over, say, the last 30 or 40 years has been essentially on the small end of the distribution of the different climate models. So the historical temperature trend tended to favor the climate models that have been not as warming in the past, and so TCR, transient climate response, is a measure of future warming, and so there is a strong correlation across the climate models between past warming and future warming. So, in other words, climate models that have been warming less in the past also tend to warm less in the future, and so by using this relationship between past and future warming, of course, if one knows about the past warming, one can basically try to constrain the future warming that is in the pipeline. And that's what many papers did. Here's basically this plot is shown for one paper, Tokarska et al. 2020. And the main result here was that the very hot climate models, so on the right-hand side here, those models that tend to become very hot very quickly in the 21st century, they seem to be unlikely given the past temperature record. Just another paper by colleagues in France, Aurélien Ribes, who basically used the Bayesian method to show that, again, making the future projections conditional on the past record, and in light red is basically the spread of the entire CMIP6 ensemble. And the darker red shading here is basically the spread if the constraint is applied. So if the future projections were considered basically considered only those plausible that have a decent estimate of the historical trend, then this would have favored a lot the colder side of the CMIP6 ensemble, and it would have said, okay, we can probably rule out the high-end CMIP6 models. Now, of course, with descent, it is a bit different because descent shows less variability because it does not have this early 20th century cold period and so on. So it may be interesting to reapply those constraints using our new understanding of the past temperature record that we get through this descent dataset. And I've been trying to do that by work in progress, where I also applied the Bayesian method introduced by Aurélien Ribes. So that's on the left-hand side. That's from the published paper from Aurélien. And where this old constraint basically really favors the low end of the CMIP6 ensemble. And if we now apply the constraint based on the new descent data set, and I should say this is very much work in progress, but it indicates that it does not really rule out like the high models so much anymore, and it also tends to rule out the very cold models. And basically with the new, if we based our constraint for the future warming based on the descent data set, then we may end up with a warming that's actually relatively close to the CMIP6 average. So we may be able to rule out the very hot models, but we may also be able to rule out the very cold models. And so, so we may be back to the CMIP6 average. So this is, I believe, an indication of how we may benefit from a better understanding of the past temperature record in order to better constrain future climate risk. But again, this plot, I should say, this is work in progress and not peer-reviewed. But with those conclusions, I would like to thank you very much for the attention, and I look forward to any questions and discussion that may come up. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian, for the great talk. Very interesting and insightful. And let's open the floor for questions. And please post them in the neural network if you haven't yet. And during we are waiting for the questions, let me ask you one myself. So I'm thinking about from a machine learning perspective. So in your first study, you train and test your model on CMIP model output, and you assume that the statistical relationship also holds in the real world. So you feed observations into the model to reconstruction. But what if the real world differs from the model?
Yes, thank you very much. That's of course an excellent and very important question. So there are 2 points on this. So maybe I start with the first one, which is that our colleague Christopher Cardo, when we try to compare our more simple statistical learning reconstruction method to the more complex deep learning image inpainting reconstruction method, we saw that it yields a very similar reconstruction. So that was good news. But again, of course, the deep neural network was also trained on the climate model, so it does not help us with this distributional shift. However, what Christopher Cardo, what he showed in his paper, in this Nature Geoscience paper, was that you can basically also train this deep learning model on the observations themselves. Of course, then you are basically constrained by the sample size, or you could make a compromise and you could train on the climate models, and then you could basically have a second retraining or transfer learning based on the observations. But in the end, he ended up with a very similar reconstruction. So that's why I do think that there are many things, of course, many relationships that are different in the climate models and in the real world, and this could cause massive distributional shifts that could cause a lot of problems in other questions. But in this particular question, because it's really about how does kind of a limited temperature variability field relate to the true global mean. So it's really it's not kind of a prediction where we are predicting a completely different quantity. We are basically just trying to do an inpainting of a variability field. And in that case, I believe this is quite safe to do, because I do not believe that the distributional shift is too large. And the second thing I would like to add to this question is what we did to kind of mediate a little bit this distributional shift was that when we put together this big matrix for training our statistical learning algorithm, we used the CMIP6 temperature anomaly patterns, but then we also tested by adding these observation-based uncertainties and biases, because this is something where we know that we are going to have a distributional shift, because the climate models are not simulating measurement uncertainties and biases. So we have been trying to show to the algorithm how these uncertainties and biases look like. And we saw that the training of the algorithm kind of really responds a little bit to the field if these uncertainties and biases are added or if they are not. So in the case, I showed you this, how these pattern of regression coefficients for the reconstruction looks like. And I said, well, the algorithm relies a lot on the tropics. And this is, of course, makes a lot of sense from a climate variability point of view, because the tropics are very informative for global mean temperatures. However, the tropics are also particularly uncertain when it comes to measurement errors long in the past, because there have been few stations, right? And so if we add these uncertainties and biases to the algorithm, we actually see that the weights become a little bit more equally distributed. So the algorithm moves the weights a little bit more to the mid latitudes. I mean, not completely. The tropics are still very important, but the algorithm kind of basically tries to respond in a way to this distributional shift by kind of putting a few more weights on the mid latitudes where there are more stations and where there is less measurement error and so on. So the algorithm sees that and tries to respond to that. So so I would think that this is important in order to alleviate this distributional shift a little bit, but of course it's very justified to really think deeply about this potential problem of a distributional shift. So thank you for the question.
Okay, yeah, thank you for your answer. Yeah. And let me check if there's some questions from the audience. Seems not yet. Okay, so yeah. Okay, so I have maybe a related question. So you mentioned that you use a AI method as a way to refine the historical records, but most AI systems still need to be trained either on the climate models or the same, let's say, imperfect observations. So how can we make sure these kind of models is not just reproducing the same bias in maybe a more complicated way?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's of course it's kind of, in a way, it's a fundamental problem, of course, because we just don't have the measurement data from 1895 everywhere on the globe, right? We just have these big gaps, and of course, there are initiatives to rescue climate data from the past. And I think these are, of course, very, very important, because that's a chance to kind of get more data from the past and have kind of a true verification test. But of course, we will never have like a full, complete spatial temperature field for 1895. Mm-hmm. However, we do know from, also from kind of testing in a recent period where we have an almost complete field and we can test those reconstruction methods, and we know that if for the recent period, if we had a coverage of 1895, so if we take a recent year and we would pretend only to have the coverage for like 1895, and we can of course test in that case how well are we able to reconstruct the global temperature mean. And I mean, this works pretty well. So we know that in theory we do not need to measure everywhere on the globe in order to be able to calculate the global mean. We can have confidence in the reconstructions that having gaps is actually okay. You can reconstruct the global mean reasonably, unless you have basically massive biases. So if you have a few gaps and they are kind of randomly distributed, or then that's okay. You can still have a reasonable reconstruction, even if they are systematically distributed and they are in certain locations, and you know that those certain locations have a certain pattern because of understanding of temperature variability. Even then, you can have a good reconstruction of the global mean temperature. The bigger problem, of course, is if we have unknown biases in the data. And that's something where, again, we can go back to the bucket measurements in, let me maybe just go to this slide. So, so that's about the uncertainties of the limitations in the coverage. But of course, we have those fundamental uncertainties that we had before 1930 or so. Almost all the sea surface temperature measurements that we have come from buckets. And we know that these buckets have been very different. We know that the protocols, how people have been measuring the temperatures in those buckets, have been very different by country and also by ship type. So, for example, the US had a very different protocol of how the measurement should be conducted to UK British ships or German ships or so. And the buckets have been quite different. And very often those metadata is just not available anymore. So the problem is not that there's too little data, but the problem is more that there's very little metadata available on how those measurements were conducted exactly. And even if we knew how to correct those data, even if we knew which kind of bucket it is, and we could maybe correct those, if we just don't have the metadata to know which bucket it was and what the protocol was, then it's very difficult to really be able to address those biases. And of course, machine learning can help to make a good reconstruction. It can help to get the error small in terms of the reconstruction error. But if there's a systematic bias, of course, then it's hard, even for machine learning. However, like the question now, I guess, is how do we go forward? And I mean, there are really interesting projects where people try to better understand those sea surface temperature data sets and basically stratifying them, because there are some understanding of where those sea surface temperature data come from. So usually, for example, in which archives they have been stored. And usually it's kind of certain countries that maintain certain archives. So you can basically split the temperature measurements by different countries from which they come from which they have been taken. And so you can basically reconstruct relatively reliable which countries, which ships have been traveling the oceans there. And so in theory, if you had a very good AI method, and that's where I think AI really comes into the picture, is that we have those different archives and those different basically sets of sea surface temperature measurements that are, of course, smaller than all the ones showing here. So there are fewer measurements, but we know they are relatively similar in how they were taken. And so my hope would be that in the future, we can come up with a good machine learning or AI system that does a reconstruction based on very different input data, say only from input data that was taken by US ships, and only input data that was taken by Japanese ships, and only input data that was taken by a certain UK ships, and then come up with those different reconstructions of those input data, and ideally also a very good uncertainty characterization of those. And then we may understand if if this bias that we are seeing in the, in the aggregated data, if we put all the measurements together as we are always doing with those standard products, if we do get a better understanding of how big the relative biases are if we reconstruct only based on the US ships or only based on German ships and so on. So I think that the AI or the machine learning can really help us in making those reconstructions and coming up with good uncertainty estimates, and then also comparing different input data streams and then trying to see how consistent are they.
Yes, thank you for sharing your insights. So we already have several questions from our audience. So one is from Francisco. She's asking that to what extent do you think the absence of the early 20th century code bias in the descent dataset could have led to higher projections after these observations were included?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So maybe I put up the descent slide again. So yeah, the question is, how is this constraint? How is it working in the end? And it turns out that the standard temperature products, they are so cold that the 20th century, like the early 20th century warming in the climate models is mostly smaller than the early 20th century in the observations, just because the observations have this very cold period at the beginning. So there is a certain model disagreement between the standard previous temperature datasets and the models. And it turns out that descent fits much better to the model simulations because descent does not have this cold period. And so if you would believe the previous standard temperature datasets, then you would have to conclude that this early cold period is to a large extent a period of natural variability because the models don't show it. And so then you would have to believe that the observations really show a larger degree of kind of decadal variability than the models are showing. And that's exactly what this constraint picks up. So if there's a large degree of variability in the observations of internal variability that has nothing to do with climate change, then of course it's harder to make a constraint for the future because you have a lot of variability in the past. So you could have a lot of variability in the future too. And that means the constraint is just not so narrow. Whereas if the variability, the internal variability, not the variability kind of internal to the climate system, if that is relatively small, at least on decadal and multi-decadal scales, then it means you can really make a narrower constraint, and that of course pushes the constraint a little bit upwards. But to be fair, of course, it's not only the absence of the early 20th century cold period that has pushed the constraint upward, in my opinion, but it's also the fact that descent has a slightly cooler, very early period. This also, because this just increases the overall amount of warming. So that means it also pushes the constraint a little bit upwards. And another thing that we should not forget is that the old papers based on the temperature constraint, they were published in 2020 and 2021. So they typically consider the temperature data up to 2018 or so. And kind of the new descent data set considers the data up until 2024. And just those 5 or 6 more years of warming have really shown us like a very big global warming, especially 2023 and 2024. And of course, those 2 very warm years also have an effect on the constraint. So it's not only the early 20th century period, but it does contribute to shifting, to the tendency that this constraint is being shifted upwards.
Okay, thank you for your answer. And we also have a question from Arkin. So the question was, by refining the historical record and the model predictions, do you think this changes the probability of high-end scenarios like SSP 585 compared to other pathways? Yeah,
so thanks for the question. So of course, the scenario 585 itself, I mean, it assumes very high emissions. And I think at this stage, 585 is really a little bit too high. Probably it's not the most likely scenario. I think it has been shown that if the countries kind of stick to the pledges reasonably, then we should not be on a 585 trajectory. But if we just assume a moderate emissions trajectory, of course, it's still important to understand what is the warming that we are going to get from those emissions. And like what kind of, at least this work in progress here tends to show, is that for any given warming scenario, like in that case, it is shown for 585, but you would get a similar result for a more moderate warming scenario. The constraint is pointing to slightly, bit higher conditions, and that means, of course, that the probability for high-end warming also goes up a bit.
Yes, okay, thank you. And we have one more question from Zakaria. I think it's quite broad. So they ask, when it comes to AI models that use large historical climate datasets, what do you think is the best way to design them so that they can keep learning and improving over time, while also staying open enough for contributions from different regions and groups?
That's a very interesting question, and I must admit I'm not really an expert on this. So I can say that from my experience, of course, there's a big difference, of course, between the AI-based weather models and AI-based models for climate system understanding, because of course the AI-based weather models, they can learn every day. They can learn also from the day-by-day verification, whereas for AI-based approaches for climate, this is of course not the case. That's also the case for climate models. They can also not be verified, of course, day by day, but that has to happen on longer timescales. However, I do think that kind of AI really does help to better understand the climate system by, for example, keeping on learning on the state-of-the-art climate models. It does help, as I showed in my presentation, for infilling or reconstructing past climate data. There's a lot of work also being done on using state-of-the-art AI models to do downscaling to say higher resolutions, which adds a lot of kind of local climate information. I think that's a very important area. And also I believe that, like, maybe one last comment on AI systems. So we are kind of going into an area where high resolution climate simulations on a global scale are being conducted, and those simulations are really at the global scale. I think they are done at 2-kilometer resolution partly by now, but it will be the case that we are not able to run those simulations for thousands of years for now, just because there's not such a computational power, but maybe only 30 years or 50 years of those really high resolution simulations. So I think their AI systems could really have a big role in basically combining the understanding from the thousands of years of climate model simulations we have on kind of coarse resolution global climate models, and the understanding of a short simulation but really high resolution. And I think their AI models really can bridge a gap to basically synthesize understanding from both of these approaches.
Yes, let's keep optimistic about AI application in the future. Yes, I think we are coming to the end of our time, and I want to thank Sebastian again for sharing this work, and also thank all of you for joining and contributing. And with that, we'll close here and hand over to the outro video.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learnt something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the e-shop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for good.